record on this time. And now you can share.
So this is just a little bit of the content that we went over last time we got together. Just some brief things about the belief system. And one of the things that we talked about last time is that I will be kind of, as I'm going into the origin story, we'll be kind of getting into this stuff in greater detail, because this is one of those spiritual traditions that many of us, if not all of us, I'm pretty sure, don't have any familiarity with. I think it would be beneficial to kind of cover these topics. We're going to be covering orishas, or those, what we would kind of equate to kind of being like angels or being like gods. Essentially, they're kind of like a secondary level, kind of underneath God. And I'll kind of get into that here in a minute, but we'll be kind of going into all of those different figures multiple times, kind of a brief overview, a little bit of an introduction, and then really getting into each of those orishas more deeply, getting into the origin story. And then, that way, when we get into the origin story, hopefully you'll have more familiarity with each of those orishas, as we're kind of understanding their role in the creation story, the creation of human life specifically. And then we'll get back into this stuff where we were talking about the Yoruba beliefs, and we were talking about particularly the belief system as it is relating to humans' kind of purpose in life. So I'll just kind of go over this again one more time. And one thing that we did last time is I just asked for some questions. So any of the content, if there are any questions that come up at any point, and feel free to type them in the chat, and that way I can just kind of grab them from there. But I will take note of those questions, and then we will kind of come back around to those things whenever it becomes relevant to where we're kind of at in the conversation. So what we had talked about a couple of weeks ago is that this tradition embraces the belief that we are all kind of passing through our own destiny or fate. And we are, the way that the story is told is that we are a part of spirit and a part of the source of all energy. And this would be the Yoruba version of God. And just like with God and the Christian faith, the Christian theology, there is the 3 elements of God. So the same thing is kind of happening here, where in Christianity we have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and here we have Olodumare. Olodumare would be the kind of what we would equate with the Father, so kind of seen as the ultimate power. So kind of the main aspect of that God, essentially. Oops. In the previous notes, if you didn't have a chance to look at the documentary, and I think I have it embedded here as well. So we watched a documentary several weeks ago, and some of these notes are looking kind of at Yoruba through the lens of this very specific community of Oshogbo. And this kind of is considered the birthplace of Yoruba. So really getting it from their perspective, because there are various ethnic groups that practice Yoruba, so the practice might look a little bit different. So those interpretations are going to look different based on the context. Another thing that we've talked about is because of the history of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade in particular, the kind of meshing together of Yoruba, that African spiritual tradition, and indigenous spiritual beliefs, those systems based on where those enslaved people were being taken, and then the European colonizers, their spiritual system, so either Christianity or Catholicism, ends up kind of getting meshed in with Yoruba. And so we end up getting many different offshoots of Yoruba, kind of newer manifestations that are a little bit different, but will kind of share similar themes. So we might see some of the same orishas, but they might actually, and one thing we'll talk about is they may go by several different names, and it will depend on which tradition we're talking about. So Yoruba is kind of the foundation. And then, Santeria would be one, Hoodoo, Voodoo, Vodun. Those would be kind of offshoots of Yoruba, and just some of the offshoots of Yoruba. I think I've also mentioned Lukumi, that would be another one. So I've talked about the ways that they really emphasize in the spiritual tradition. And the reason we use the language of spirituality and not religion is because it is very interconnected. We can't really kind of disconnect our spiritual selves from every other aspect of our lives. So recognizing kind of that interconnected relationship is really important, and recognizing the connections between our spiritual and physical realm, but also we've talked about this in the context of oppression, for example, and spiritual bypassing. So we can't kind of use our spiritual identities as a way of trying to kind of refrain from, having particular hard conversations about oppression against Black people in this context, doing necessary work to kind of address oppression against Black people. And that being really central, something that we've talked about before because of the legacy of slavery, oppression and liberation. This kind of work is really central. And that's a deep part of the history, as far as how these traditions have been shaped over time because of slavery, and legacies of oppression and legacies of healing as well. And using spirituality to heal in particular ways, using it as a form of liberation, as a form of kind of reclaiming identity, remembering, kind of reconnecting to those ancestral traditions that for some of us, especially African Americans or folks in other parts of the world, again, who have been, whose ancestors were enslaved, being able to kind of reconnect with their traditions is an important part of that legacy of liberation and resistance. So many different ways that we can kind of think about the interconnected kind of layers of our spiritual selves and all other elements of our lives, and all other aspects and areas of our lives. So the idea being that we're going through this constant cycle of life and death. So they do believe in the idea of reincarnation, and we come into these different forms of physical bodies. And the idea is that we're supposed to be coming here, learning, retaining information, and going through a process of evolution towards transcendence. And this is something that we're going to be kind of talking more about later on and really getting into more deeply, especially after we get into the origin story, why humans were created, what the purpose of humans are, as far as connecting back to that origin, or back to the belief system here. So before we come to the earth, we choose our destinies, what we're going to do in the world, where we're going to live, who we will love. And part of that idea being that we kind of come in with these clusters of souls, essentially. So, there are particular friends, family members, lovers, mentors who have been in your life. And the idea being that kind of all of those various people who have kind of connected with you in your life, these are people who are kind of within that cluster who you, as you go through that reincarnation, they're also kind of coming back with you as well. So you're always kind of reconnecting with those same souls, essentially, even though the roles and relationships might be different. So for example, if you're romantic partners with someone in one life, you might actually be friends or maybe siblings, or have a mentor or mentee kind of relationship in another life. So those relationship dynamics can change, and the power dynamics there can change. And we also decide how we will die as well. So once we come to Earth, the purpose becomes that everything that we've kind of set up, all of the blueprints we've kind of laid out before we get to the Earth, we've forgotten them, and we are supposed to then remember and claim that future that we've mapped out for ourselves before we had come into the world, and kind of fulfill our destiny, essentially. And I mentioned the Holy Trinity, making that connection. So in this context, Olodumare, and I tried to put the phonetic spellings in there just to help with the pronunciation. So if I've missed them in any areas, do let me know, and I can always go in and update the notes. But Olodumare, so it's kind of going from, I don't want to say least significant aspect, but Alofi is actually the aspect of God that is closest to the earth, because this was actually someone who is a human being. This is someone who is a real life person. And I kind of made a connection. You folks are probably familiar with Rastafari. And Rastafari was a person. That's not just the name of the spiritual tradition. That was actually the name of a person. what ended up happening was, as the emperor of Ethiopia, when he was crowned, he took on the name of Ras, and Ras would be like a title, and Tafari being his name. And this again is connected back to that legacy of slavery and oppression, anti-Black oppression, and this whole spiritual tradition being kind of born out of this idea that this political leader was someone who was going to kind of deliver Black people from anti-Black oppression, right? Liberate Black people from anti-Black oppression. So just like Rastafari was a real life human being who was then kind of deified, the same thing is true of Olofi. So Olofi or Olofin, again, depending on the spiritual tradition, with keeping in mind that Yoruba is a foundation. This literally translates into owner of the law or governor. And again, this is in connection to the role that he played in his actual life. So Oduduwa was actually the name of the human. And similarly, again, just to kind of make that connection back, Rastafari's name before he was coronated as the emperor of Ethiopia was actually Haile Selassie. So same type of thing, where when he was deified, he actually took on another name. Even though for Rastafari, he actually took on another name in his actual life. So Oduduwa was the name of the human who was then deified as Olofi or Olofin, and he was the first governor and held the title of Olofin Aye, which means governor of the world, and held the title of Olofin Adimula, the governor who receives great or large offerings. And that had to do with the ways that he was praised in his life as a political figure. And again, kind of alluding to the ways that he was being deified in his life and before his death, before he kind of becomes this aspect of God, essentially. So this aspect of God is not a supreme or all-powerful being. So again, kind of going back to the Holy Trinity, this would not be the Father. This would not be kind of the more powerful, like the all-powerful, all-knowing aspect of God. This is the aspect that is kind of closest to human beings in closest relation. So he is associated with one, an all-powerful supreme being because of Oduduwa's position as the first governor of Earth. And being godlike, again, with the ways that he was being praised and things like that. And then becoming the first Orisha. And as I said, I use a comparison of angels or kind of like gods, kind of like a secondary level underneath God, kind of answering to God and being kind of governed by. So Olorun is the second aspect of God in the Yoruba tradition. And Olorun is literally translates into owner of the sky. And this especially correlates with the sun. So Olorun is considered a sun deity or a sky deity as owner of the sky, owner of the sun. And the sun being the source of all life. And representing oneness, representing the energy that from which we are all born, and obviously that we need to survive as well. And so Olorun holds the title of God Supreme. And then Olodumare, this is the, again, all-powerful, all-knowing. This name literally translates into the owner of the times that have not yet manifested and times infinite. So times eternal, times immemorial. Before there was time, there was always this aspect, there was always this God. So this was the energy that existed before all of us did, the almighty power. And Ifa, which is their scripture, so that would be like the Christian Bible or the Quran. So Ifa recognized that time was not created, and thus Olodumare was present in place of time before time existed again, just meaning that this was God before, before the creation of anything, including the creation of the Orishas as well. And I always put videos and articles in, just in the case that you would want to go and watch the videos on your own, just to have that kind of visual aid or auditory thing. So Olodumare is the all-powerful supreme being, the ultimate creator and the owner of the universe, and the creator of the Orishas, so those secondary divinities as well. So this is a God that's seen as constant and reliable, transcends the male-female binary. So that's something we've talked about. There are Orishas that are operating within more of the gender binary. So Olodumare actually transcends that binary, is able to discern what's in the hearts of people. That's that all-knowing piece. And is considered the aspect of God that is father to the Orishas, or the creator of those secondary divinities. I'm just gonna take a moment really quickly to check the chat. Okay. Oh, and in regards to the question, yes, there are divination tools to remember what we decided about our lives before we were born. So palm or cola nuts can actually be used as a form, and that's just one way. Water is we kind of talked about the fact that water is very significant in these traditions as well. So there are various divination tools, but cola nuts and palm nuts can be very significant, especially with connecting to so in this tradition, we also have corresponding orishas. And I was actually going to show a video if we have time, just for fun. It's almost kind of like horoscopes where, you have your sign and your corresponding personality traits, but in this case, you have your particular orisha, and based on the orisha, it kind of informs, same thing, personality traits and things like that. And that kind of, again, can kind of become one of those connections to figuring out what is the purpose, as far as the fact that each orisha has their own kind of corresponding kind of aspects, or some of them are particularly rooted in healing, rooted in love, rooted in those types of things. They're all kind of representing or providing, offering different types of, not to use the word services, but they're offering different types of kind of gifts, those types of things, right? When we're talking about the context of manifestation. So you pray to different orishas for different types of things. So they have, they represent different things, including different personality traits as well. And this is, again, a very, very brief overview, just so that we can kind of learn. And I kind of am repeating myself a little bit over the weeks, just so that we can kind of commit this to memory. And one thing you might notice, even with some of the images of these gods, because this is, these are three aspects of one god, is that some of the images may be very similar or the same. Like if you were to do some research on your own, there's a lot of kind of meshing these aspects together. So we'll be doing some brief introductions and then really getting into them more deeply, especially for the sake of, once we get into the origin story. So you can see here, obviously, this is a part of the origin story here, just in this photograph. The creation of land, because everything was water. There was the sky, there was water, so this is a creation of land. So then we'll kind of get into that story and kind of figure out which aspects of God essentially become important to that story. So if Olodumare is the father of the Orishas, then Olorun is the chief god who rules over the sky and heavens and created the sun and the universe. Olorun is active in terrestrial or earthly and heavenly affairs, oversees those orishas, so they would answer to Olorun. And Olorun is an enabler of those who achieve any end. So again, if you're thinking about manifestation, and Olorun cannot be found for those who seek them out. So in the context of prayer, that kind of thing, you're not really going to be going to these main aspects of God. You're going to be going to the going through the orishas, and that's kind of the purpose that they serve, is to kind of act as this bridge between God and obviously the different aspects of God and humanity. And with the orishas, again, they all have different things to kind of offer. They represent different things, and so you would actually kind of pray to them directly rather than going through God. And you can kind of think about it as a hierarchy. So if you're thinking about, Olorun as being the one who's kind of in control of the orishas, right? And Olorun even being under Olodumare, this all-powerful supreme being, this being kind of the second tier underneath, and getting down into then the orishas. So they kind of act as a bridge. And it's kind of like, if you think about how a bureaucracy works, right? You can't just go from the very bottom rung of power all the way up to the top. You're kind of going up that kind of chain of command. So we can kind of think about that as a hierarchy. Olofin is seen as the messenger. The literal translation being owner of the palace or ruler of earth. He indirectly bonds, supervises, and directs humans through the Orishas. And his power and direct bonding is only accessible to Yoruba priests and priestesses. And we kind of watched in that documentary that I showed a second ago. In that documentary, we actually got to see two African-American women who went to Oshogbo to go through their kind of priestess initiation. So you can check that out if you haven't had a chance yet. But it's a very, training is involved. There's a lot of learning involved. There's a whole process involved. And as we saw, for those of us who had a chance to watch the documentary, it's a pretty extensive process that goes into becoming a Yoruba priest or priestess. So only these individuals are able to directly connect with God. So again, not just anybody can kind of reach out and connect. You would then, rather than connecting through Olofin, you would connect through an Orisha. And again, depending on what you are trying to manifest, that would kind of inform who you would be reaching out to. So one thing that we will do as we're getting into introductions and things, we will kind of go back around and actually get into more deep, detailed information that will actually include processes of how to kind of summon or how to manifest, how to pray for, how to create altars for, how to manifest through these particular Orishas. So you cannot manifest without first appealing to Olofin. And again, that does not mean direct contact necessarily, but you have to, make that appeal. Olofin is the one that distributed power to each Orisha, holds the secrets of creation, and gave humans the power to procreate or reproduce. So it was actually humans who prayed to Olofin to have the opportunity to reproduce. And so it was Olofin who granted that. And so when we get into the creation story of how humans were created, we will actually get into those details more deeply. So we're not really getting to that right now. So with the seven African powers are seen as the strongest and most respected of the Orishas. So as we talked about before, there are anywhere from 201 to like 1,700 Orishas. One thing that we'll kind of go over is that for each individual Orisha, there are actually many names. So that might be where we're getting some of those numbers from, just to keep that in mind. It depends on the tradition. So based on the tradition, they might have a corresponding, name for within a different tradition. So Olodumare created the Orishas to populate the earth, which is known as Aye in Yoruba, and to provide assistance to humanity to help them to be successful, especially again within the context of that larger purpose of figuring out your destiny, reclaiming, remembering, and claiming that future that you've kind of set out for yourself. So the Orishas are again those kind of secondary divinities, the heavenly entities that are assisting Olorun and act as that bridge between humans and God. So there are various traditions. So that's a part of where we get the numbers from as well. And one thing, in addition to that, with those different traditions, as I mentioned before, some of these African ethnic groups were being kidnapped by European groups, obviously. Some of those groups were Christian, some of them were Catholic. So when we saw that the colonizers were Catholic, for example, because during slavery, it was illegal for African people to practice their own spiritualities. If anything, they had to practice Christianity or Catholicism, and even that initially was not allowed, but then it was kind of forced as a way of trying to kind of get them to accept their position within slavery. So what ended up happening was, because they were not able to participate in or practice their own spiritual traditions, they would still do it anyway, but they would do it in a way where they were using, for example, Catholic, they were using Catholic deities, Catholic saints in place of the Orishas. And so there would be a corresponding Catholic saint that would be used in place of an Orisha. So they were technically still practicing Yoruba, but they were doing it undercover and secretly, and using, Christian figures or Catholic figures as a way of being able to kind of do that in secret. So that might be also a part of where we're drawing on different kind of spiritual entities. So the 7 African powers are invoked in various spiritual traditions that stem from Yoruba. Lukumi is one that I've kind of mentioned briefly before: Vodou, Santeria, Hoodoo, Voodoo, folk Catholicism, Candomblé. So these are just some. And one thing that I talked about is that we can really kind of get into some of those distinctions, but we'll kind of do it rather than going into each one individually, because they do overlap so much. I'll probably just mention those distinctions kind of as we're going through things. That might kind of be easier because it's the same basis, the same foundation. A lot of it is still the same, you know, from one tradition to the next. So it'd just be an easier way to cover the nuances as we go along. So when invoking the 7 African powers together through prayer, they have great power to help practitioners manifest. And again, as we saw with that documentary, manifesting is really central to Yoruba, even if it's just for, you know, in the context of manifesting for yourself in particular ways. In ways that we, you know, in a Western context might see as selfish, if that makes sense. Just to say, there's nothing wrong with being selfish, right? We have the right to kind of care for ourselves, have our needs and desires met. And so we talked about how in this tradition, joy is really central, right? And, you know, dancing, drinking, partying, singing, just like having a good time, right? That's really central to the tradition. Having, you know, experiencing joy and really leaning into the joy is really central. In comparison to maybe with Christianity, for example, it might be that the practices, or even Catholicism, the practices might not necessarily kind of be rooted in the same types of expressions of joy and things like that, right? Those types of practices. It might be more rooted in, you know, shame, for example, restriction, things like that. So this is not restrictive, right? It's very expressive. It's celebrating people, right? And people being able to live their lives fully, having joy and things like that. And that's really significant, again, especially in the context of oppression, because we tend to lack, and within a global context, because anti-Blackness is rampant in the global context, and we are always kind of dealing with and fighting, you know, anti-Black oppression, being able to have the joy, being able to really lean into that and have those experiences, again, that's an act of resistance. You know, being able to move beyond just surviving and actually living and thriving, right? That's a part of the manifestation, right? Living the life you want to live, having, you know, manifesting the best life you can possibly live. It's not just about surviving and getting your basic needs met. Let's move beyond that, right? Our lives are more complex and dynamic than that. So let's like lean into the joy. And so that becomes really important in these, in this tradition. And it just to make a connection, it makes me think about something that I had seen recently. Within some indigenous traditions, there is the idea that when it comes to our lives, there's not necessarily a deep meaning in the context of, you know, sometimes when we think about, you know, what is my purpose, it becomes a conversation about, you know, what's this kind of profound impact that I'm going to have on the world. And that arguably kind of becomes a bit self-centered as well, right? But that doesn't become really the important question. What becomes important is just recognizing that we're alive to be alive, right? We're alive to have a good life, to have joy in our lives, to enjoy life, and to do the best that we can to create better conditions for those who come after us, right? To improve those kinds of conditions so that we can move to a space where we're thriving, again, especially in the context of oppression. So thinking about it that way, it's a really good, you know, thinking about it in the context of resistance is really important. And yeah, when it comes to the divination practices, I will definitely bring in some videos. And I would love to share videos that cover that, and also some videos that get into some of those, again, invocations, prayers, setting up altars. We talked about the significance of our own ancestors as well. So Making an altar that is for your ancestors, and again, whoever you are kind of uh, praying to. So I would love to do some of that stuff. And we talked about the fact that this is an open practice, or it can be an open practice. And I think that with that altar making, in the context of making altars for our ancestors, that's definitely something that we could all do together. So if and when that happens, I will announce it ahead of time, just so folks are prepared to actually do. And with any of that kind of stuff. That way folks can join those kinds of activities if you're interested. So we're gonna start with, I refer to him as Alegba or Papa Legba. So in our previous conversations, this is how I've referred to him personally. Elegbara would be another one. Get that out of the way. Okay. So Eshu Elegbara would be one of the names, Alegua, Papa Legba. And actually, when we started the class, at the very beginning, if I can get out of here, we actually got to see a whitewashed representation of Papa Legba. Let me just see if I can find. And actually, maybe we didn't. So we were covering, I got into, if you've seen American Horror Story season 3, where they do Coven, they actually do use hoodoo, right, which is an offshoot of Yoruba, but they were portraying it through a very white interpretation, or a whitewashed interpretation, what's called a Eurocentric lens, meaning like a European-centered framework or lens for reading and understanding what we were seeing in this context, this African spiritual tradition. And we were seeing it through a white lens in which we see Santeria, hoodoo, voodoo, all of those offshoots of Yoruba as evil. Why? Well, because during slavery, these spiritual traditions were seen as, again, exactly what they were, acts of resistance. They were not understood in the same way that I'm explaining them necessarily. The ways that they were understood as, when they're engaging in their rituals, that's them plotting rebellions, right? That's them plotting uprisings and things like that. That becomes a way, during slavery, we're talking about West Africa, we're talking about various different ethnic groups who were being kidnapped and sold into slavery, especially from what is now Nigeria and Ghana, for example. So various different languages being spoken. And what they would do is they would intentionally separate out different folks from the same ethnic groups, mix them up with folks from different ethnic groups who spoke different languages. And they did that as a way of trying to keep these individuals from being able to, again, organize and rebel, right? Engage in these successful uprisings. And enslaved, I just want to say, because I use this language, enslaved is the more appropriate term. It's not appropriate to say slave. And the reason is, when we say enslaved, we're recognizing and acknowledging that this is something that was done to them. This was kind of a status that was put upon them externally, that they were forced into externally. It was something that was done to them. It was not who they were. It was not indicative of their identities or the entireties of their lives, or who they were. There's this idea, and I can't remember what the theory is called, but there was this idea that because Black people were living during slavery and that kind of violence and extremely overt racism, that Black people's lives were only kind of miserable and made up of suffering and things like that, right? And not really looking at the complexities of their lives. But that's not who they were, right? The totality of who they were human beings, not property. And so within our system of slavery, what was called chattel slavery, they were treated like property, right? Immovable property that could not be moved from the land. So it becomes a way of kind of distancing from that status, that objectification, again, kind of recentering and reframing that history appropriately to really recognize and hold accountable kind of what was done to enslaved people. So I just want to put that little tidbit in there. So I was talking about American Horror Story, but we were looking at Marie Laveau. And so we actually did not get to see an image of, and let me just see if I can find a picture. So they ended up doing a rendition of Papa Legba in American Horror Story. And the way that they frame the character, if you haven't seen it, is they kind of show him, and maybe you've seen even like the Princess and the Frog. It's a very similar character. And the way that they represent this character is that he, again, is kind of evil, almost kind of similar to the way that we would see Satan. So, when we see representations in media of like demon worship or Satan worship, and there's kind of the sacrificing of babies, right? Innocence. That kind of thing was showing up here. It becomes a way of creating that dichotomy where the African spiritual traditions are seen as bad, as evil. And then on the other side of things, for those Wicca traditions that they were kind of juxtaposing or contrasting within the show, which, they even did it racially. So we had the white witches who were Wicca, and then we had the black witches who were doing voodoo, right? So they were conjurers. And so it became this dichotomy of good versus evil, where we're always representing African spiritualities as evil. And that's where that comes from, that colonial history of, during slavery, trying to represent that as evil, as bad, banning that because they didn't want those uprisings to happen in the context of abolishing slavery, right? Getting rid of slavery in the United States is the context I'm talking about. So if you've seen it, that's just something to think about. And another thing is they actually kind of end up mashing up multiple figures. So it doesn't necessarily become a representation of Papa Legba. It becomes a representation of actually somewhat of a different figure in hoodoo that we can kind of talk about later, who plays a similar role but is a completely different figure. So we can kind of talk about that later on when we get into some of those, again, nuances in the traditions. And similar to Olofin, because Ashua Legbara is the messenger between worlds and the guardian of the crossroads, you always have to pray to or appeal to Papa Legba before you pray to the other Orishas. So he's seen as a trickster because a lot of crossroads deities are seen as tricksters. And he is seen as a guide for the dead and a guardian of travelers. And this is the Orisha to call upon when you need a road opened and to open communication with all other Orishas and spirits. So again, you have to go through Papa Legba first before you go in and connect to any other Orisha. So always go to Papa Legba first. One thing we can probably do together, actually, as the Crossroads Orisha, one thing that people will do is they will actually go to a crossroads and they will invoke Papa Legba there and in order to manifest. And the way that it works is you would kind of make, and I've said this before, just like with Christianity, the way that prayer works is not to say, you put your prayer out there and it's kind of like making a wish, to a genie, and you kind of just get your wish, like, oh, I would love to have a Corvette, right? That's not how it works. You have to put in some kind of work or some kind of investment in order to manifest whatever it is you're wanting to manifest. So when you invoke Papa Legba, the way that it works is you would make your kind of offering or your commitment, essentially. I think that's a really good word. You would make your commitment. So, let's say that for me, I'm like, I really want to get published. And so I go to a crossroads, I invoke Papa Legba, and in order for me to get published, the commitment I make is I am going to, and it can be literally anything. So I could say, well, I'm going to dedicate myself to writing 1 hour a day. And I know maybe that sounds a little bit goofy, right? Because obviously you're putting the work in to manifest what you want to manifest, but it can be anything. I mean, it could be completely unrelated. I could say, well, I'm going to dedicate 20 hours of community service a month. And that will be my offering, my commitment in exchange for what I'm trying to manifest. But of course, again, just as with anything, you have to make some kind of an investment as well. And if you fall back on your commitment, if you don't fulfill your commitment, then you kind of get punished essentially a tenfold for not following through on your commitment. So it's a tricky thing, right? If you want to invoke and manifest something through Papa Legba, you have to make sure you are absolutely dedicated to fulfilling your promise. Otherwise, you're essentially cursing yourself, right? It will come back on you tenfold. And this is just another picture. And so this is very different. Notice this is very different than that representation I just showed you. And that's why I bring up the Princess and the Frog if you're familiar with that representation. And that's not Papa Legba. That's actually, again, as I mentioned, American Horror Story kind of mashes up two different spiritual figures. So this is actually more genuine, more authentic of a representation of Eshua Legbara than the one that we saw in that show, which was actually invoking a different spirit. So one thing I noticed here at the bottom is this is a Vodun Veve. That is a spiritual symbol, and that's French. Again, thinking about who colonized where. So this is coming from the French and that cultural influence of that dominant colonizer group. So they have these Vodun symbols or voodoo symbols, and you see these in hoodoo as well. So these are spiritual symbols used during rituals, and you can use these to invoke particular orishas, obviously. And there are other ones that are actually a bit more generalized. So I talked about earlier, I think I talked about, let me just see if I've got it here. I talked about other symbols that we can also get into called a dinkras. And here's one of them. So there are these symbols and they all represent something very different, but you can use them to, when you're trying to invoke particular things, when you're trying to manifest particular things, you can then kind of use that complementary symbol. So this is a little bit different, and we'll come to this later on. But for example, this symbol Sankofa means go back and get it. And this was, as we were talking about with the ancestors, right? Connecting back to our past, reclaiming our ancestral traditions, ancestral knowledge, those practices as a way of getting in tune. And we can even think about that as a potential avenue for, again, getting back on track with our kind of purpose, essentially, right? That kind of reclaiming, remembering and reclaiming our purpose, our future that we've kind of set out for ourselves. And I agree. I think it's been really frustrating that we see this like dichotomy happen where we always see Christianity as good and pure, and we're always measuring everything up against it in contrast. And I talked about why that was at length, and I know Alex has heard this many times already, about why that dichotomy existed. Obviously, I talked about slavery, but even before we got there, right, in order to justify enslaving people. And I think manifest destiny, if I'm not mistaken, I think tends to be covered. I think that might be one of the only times we get to talk about colonization in school. But with manifest destiny, just this idea that, because we're white Christian men, right, we have the God-given right to stake claim to the land and obviously everything on it. The idea was only Christian nations are seen as nations with human life on them, right? Only Christians are seen as human. Therefore, only Christian nations are seen as inhabited by people. Otherwise, obviously, for non-Christian nations, they were seen as uninhabited and then open to be discovered. We all probably are familiar with that already, but that's how this kind of feeds in, right? It was all about creating that dichotomy where for any kind of indigenous spiritualities, they were evil, they were backward, they were savage, less than human, and they needed these Christians to save them, not only in the context of Christianity, right? Like we need to save them, they're damned, they're beastly, they're demonic in that context, but also we're human, right? As Christians, we're human, and therefore, our ways are superior, our institutions are superior, obviously, including the religious institution, looking at Christianity and the Christian church. Or Catholicism and the Catholic Church, depending on which colonizers we're talking about. And the idea being, we need to kind of indoctrinate them into, and obviously they didn't frame it that way. They framed it as they need our care, our guidance, right? Our control over their lives. We need to indoctrinate them into our institutions, our religious institutions as well, and teach them our kind of superior ways of being, right? It became a way of justifying European control over other nations as they were trying to build empires, right? Taking claim to more and more land, political power, economic power over those nations. So that's kind of the purpose that it served. So these are magical associations. And again, this is just a really brief overview. So we will actually get into this a lot more deep. There's so much more that goes into this that we will get into more deeply, but hopefully this becomes a way of really helping us to kind of learn about who these Orishas are and really commit them to memory. So again, I usually say Papa Legba or Alegwa. Eshu Alegbara is the language, is another name as well. So whichever feels more comfortable. I will probably refer to Eshu Alegbara as Alegba or Papa Legba more frequently than not. And that's coming more so from Vodun, from Voodoo traditions. So his domain again is crossroads. All roads pass again as being kind of that messenger, that kind of bridge between the spiritual and physical world or human world. His domain is thresholds and doors. He's a guide for the dead, a messenger. Traveling is a part of that. You can almost think about the kind of like with the Grim Reaper, that whole concept of helping guide the dead. So that's a piece of the role that he plays. Fertility is another one. Comedy, mischief, again, that coming from that kind of trickster, prankster energy, and healing as well. And with the associated saints, this is going back into what I was talking about with in the context of them, you know, if they wanted to continue practicing Yoruba, but they wanted to do it secretly, they would then pray to saints and maybe have saints on their altar who represented or stood in for a particular Orisha. So it would be Saint Anthony, Saint Lazarus, and Saint Peter that were standing in for Papa Legba on their altars and in their prayers and things like that as a way of secretly being able to continue practicing their own traditions. So he has over 200 manifestations as far as how he manifests or how he appears to people. And it depends on the tradition. So as a young man with a phallus or penis, a concrete head with a cowrie shell, eyes and mouth. And I don't think I had, oh, actually we have the cowrie shell images in that one. An old limping man with a cane and a hat. So this being kind of one of the more popular representations compared to, again, that one from American Horror Story that was actually kind of invoking a different figure altogether that we will talk about later on. Excuse me. Associated colors are black and red. So again, in the context of making an altar, for example, then these would be the color candles you might use, for example, as a way of invoking Eshu Elegbara. For offerings, tobacco, rum. So with the rituals, what you would do is you would, for example, light a cigar and you would, I'm a pothead, so take a hit is what I was going to say, but you take a hit of the cigar and you kind of blow that out on behalf of essentially the Orisha. And then you also put some rum in your mouth. You don't drink it, you don't swallow it, but you would actually kind of spray it over the area that you would be doing the ritual. And that would be kind of your way of making the offering. And then you might have some candy, spicy food, toys, and things that you would put in a dish or something on the altar. And then after you are done using those items, you would discard them. You could discard them by burying them. You could discard them, depending on what the items are, obviously, by throwing them in the river, particularly if it's something that's biodegradable and safe to put in the river or in, a stream of water. Or you can also throw it in the trash. That would kind of be considered a last resort. Preferably burying it, that kind of thing, is something that we would do in this tradition. And then associated animals being a mouse and a rooster. And again, as we're kind of getting into these stories, then we'll kind of unpack these details more deeply. So with Ogun, this would be the second of the 7 African powers. And again, different names based on the tradition. So Ogu, Gu, Ogun, Ogum. And Ogun is seen as an ironworking, healing Orisha, a shaman and a healer. And he's not merely a spirit of iron, but is seen as iron itself and thus rules over metalworking and alchemy of any kind. He has polarity in his healing ability and his ability to destroy as well. So that kind of, that spectrum, kind of both ends of that spectrum. So Ogun is a patriarchal spirit, and patriarchal meaning male-centered, male-dominated, male-controlled. In this context, thinking about the role of the patriarch in the family or in the household institution. So the one who watches over the children and families, kind of as a protector, and thinking about that again in a patriarchal context. That actually kind of ties back into what I was saying about the ways we use the language of guidance and control, or excuse me, guidance and care in the context of colonization. That's called a paternalistic type of relationship. So with paternalism, we treat marginalized groups as if they are kind of childlike. Again, that's where we get into that argument. If they can't take care of themselves, right? They need control. They need to be guided by us. So that being a way of kind of exercising power over, control over. So just to kind of make the connection. But Ogun is one of the most respected orishas in the African diaspora. And just as a reminder, or for folks who might not be familiar, the diaspora, and you might hear this in other contexts, the word diaspora itself is referring to the dispersion of peoples from a particular region, and then kind of across the road, depending on where those groups kind of traveled or migrated over the course of time. So in this context, we're talking about the dispersion of African peoples from the continent of Africa to various parts of the world, especially within the context of the transatlantic slave trade of the 1500s. Ogun is known as the spirit who never rests. Ogun, as the iron, the spirit of iron, has close ties to blood and has a particular relationship with blood, takes blood offerings, enjoys blood offerings, and can have a high bloodlust, again, maybe getting back into the polarity. So if you are bleeding in any form, and that includes menstruation as well, never approach or invoke Ogun because he enjoys the blood offerings. And so that could be seen as dangerous, essentially. And again, something that we'll get into more deeply. And just so you can see different representations of Ogun as well. And we can then talk about, as we're getting into, especially with divination and the different tools of divination, we can then get into like, why are cowrie shells so important? Because you may notice they have these crowns and they're kind of adorned in cowrie shells in many cases. And there's a reason for that. So we can kind of get into that a little bit more deeply as well. So Ogun's domain would be iron and metalworking, alchemy, healing, weapons, oath-taking, orphans, and the homeless, getting back into that kind of patriarchal or thinking about that role in kind of protecting and overseeing families, cutting through obstacles, technology, vehicles and transportation, railroad tracks, shape-shifting, and so on. Again, more associated saints, James the Great, Saint Peter, John the Baptist, Saint Martin and Andrew, and Archangel Michael. So drawing on Catholicism and Christianity as well. So he's seen as a strong man with fiery eyes. He manifests again as metal itself, as the actual, as actual metal itself. And there are many different manifestations and personas that we will get into as we get into Ogun more deeply. And I will add the phonetic spellings to everything, just so you have that as well. But that would be Ogun Blanjo and Ogun La Flambeau. Associated colors being green, red, white, black, and blue. Again, these would be colors in that you might want to use on your altar if you're praying to Ogun or trying to invoke Ogun. So you can leave offerings by railroad tracks because that is one of the domains. Red palm oil, red candles, cigar, rum, wine, liquor, dragon's blood, metal chains, spikes, metal tools, weapons, toy planes and cars, meat, red beans, grains of paradise, spicy foods, and so on. And for the altar, having an altar that's concealed in a cabinet or closet with a three-legged cauldron and offerings. Again, any of these offerings would work. One thing that I've mentioned before, especially again in the context of slavery, particular items might not have always been available. And so one thing that would happen is it's not always so important to have these specific things. You know, you do what you can with what you have. For folks who were enslaved, obviously, right, they were working with what they could find, what they could access, depending on the lands they were in. And obviously they were taken from their ancestral lands, so there were going to be different types of material resources and things like that, depending on where they were taken. And so they may have been kind of substituting things in. And that's perfectly okay, right? What matters is not the objects. And we kind of talked about the materialism that happens in spirituality, right? It becomes a lot about buying particular items and needing to have those particular stones and jewels and needing to have those particular oils and things like that. If you don't have that kind of access, if access is an issue sometimes, especially financially, and even again, depending on where we're living, particular items might be harder to come by. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with substituting items and using what you can kind of get access to, because that's, the items themselves are not as important as what you're actually manifesting, the work that you're actually doing. And we can talk about that, if when we get into, creating an altar, for example, and invoking particular orishas, we can talk about that more. And I can kind of give some examples of, let's say we don't have these things, here's what we could do instead. So Obatala is the third of these 7 African powers. And Obatala is known as a cool spirit of healing and peace. And this image of Obatala actually is really representative of the ways that we saw in that documentary when we were watching the 2 women who were becoming kind of ordained, I suppose we could say, as priestesses in the Yoruba tradition. They were actually represented wearing a cowrie shell, crown, kind of like this one, and kind of adorned in very similar garb. So you'll see this kind of imagery a lot. And we can kind of, again, get into those material items and what the material items represent as well, kind of the significance of those. And you'll notice again the kind of breaking with the binaries as far as gender expression. So Obatala isn't necessarily a masculine spirit, but is feminine. So Obatala was credited with the job of creating human bodies, and particularly with imperfections like blindness and other defects. We actually watched a very, very short, I was kind of talking about how the reason we need to really get deeply into all of these orishas first is because when we get into the origin story of how humans were created, then we'll kind of have a basis of understanding who all of these individuals are. So we kind of watched a very, very, very brief overview of the origin story that just that it wasn't extremely detailed. So we will be getting into the details and again getting into a lot of the figures that weren't necessarily covered in that video. But one of the figures that was covered in the video was Obatala. And if you remember, for those of you who saw the video, in that video, what happens is he wants to go and create humans, and he ends up getting drunk and creating humans that have all of these defects. And so I kind of talked about, ableism and how there is some ableism in the traditions. I did talk about the fact that during slavery, one of the beliefs was that to be dismembered or disfigured in life and then buried that way would mean that you would come back in the next life disfigured in those same ways. And so for enslaved people who would commit suicide as a way of escaping slavery, their bodies would be dug up and dismembered for other enslaved people to see as a way of kind of threatening them, right? And using and weaponizing their spiritual beliefs against them, that they would be disfigured in the next life. So that is ableist, right? And we can kind of unpack and talk about the implications of that later on. I think I also alluded to the fact that, not having understandings of particular health conditions and things like that led to ableism, ableist practices, and forms of violence, even in the context of the belief about albino people, right? And their bones as having magical properties if you grind their bones into a dust. So as you can imagine, there was the genocide essentially of albino people in particular parts of the continent because of these beliefs. So we can kind of talk about some of those implications of ableism and how they impact some of these traditions. And again, maybe how people have kind of, kind of dealt with, maybe addressed and dealt with those histories, those legacies of being ableist. So Obatala, seen as the gentlest of the 7 African powers and being very patient, rules over legal matters and brings legitimate justice, and prefers people who control their emotions and are level-headed, peaceful, calm, that cool, calm, laid back type energy. So Obatala's magical associations, and he does use the he, his, him pronouns. Those are the pronouns that we refer to Obatala by, even though Obatala presents as more kind of feminine, as you'll notice in appearance, as far as wearing like a flowy white gown, and again having the really having this crown, this cowrie shell crown. So kind of again outside of that binary, that gender binary, as far as gender expression. So his domain is justice and legal matters, peace and serenity, protection of the blind, mute, and those with various birth defects, because again, he is the kind of the father of those particular humans, easing tempers and rage, sobriety, creativity, and healing. And you'll notice that healing is really central in a lot of these contexts. And he gets associated with Jesus Christ. And I know that gets confusing because again, when we were talking about the 3 aspects of God, Olodumare, Olofin, and Olorun, we would assume that one of them would be associated with Jesus Christ. But again, keeping in mind that we were using saints and deities as a way of trying to mirror or mask the fact that folks were participating in these traditions. So the manifestation, again, how they appear to people is similar to Jesus: long hair, pure white clothing. And we might not necessarily be referring to white Jesus, right? Keeping in mind where Jesus came from. So not the whitewash version per se. And white being that color, being the color that he is associated with. Sugar, shea butter, water, milk, no alcohol. So you'll notice a lot of orishas you can offer alcohol. This one specifically cannot. So it's just something to be mindful of when doing these types of, again, building an altar or trying to invoke these spirits. It is important to be mindful, especially of what they do not like. So we might substitute, and that's okay, but not with particular items that they absolutely do not like. And that will come up in particular contexts. And there will be particular contexts as well where you cannot invoke particular orishas together. So there will be some of those different types of boundaries, essentially, we can say, right? The orishas have their boundaries about what they kind of will and will not accept. Associated animals are white doves, white elephants, and snails. So here is Yamaya. Yamaya is a water orisha. The ways that we understand Oshun, they are related. They are sisters, and so they're both orishas of the water. So Yamaya is an orisha that presides over the oceans specifically, whereas for Oshun, we were talking about how she is the orisha of rivers, so a little bit different. So Yamaya rules over everything ocean related. In many cases, she gets depicted as a mermaid. I think I kind of have that image there. She's known as the Great Mother who protects motherhood and female sexuality. She gives abundant treasures and foods like the sea, but can also be angered like the sea. So again, seeing kind of the 2 ends of that spectrum, kind of similar to when we were talking about Ogun and having those 2 different aspects, right? The ability to heal, but also the ability to cause harm and destruction. So that same kind of dichotomy that exists. So you cannot invoke and kind of praise or pray to or worship Yamaya and Oya in the same area. And I will be getting to Oya. Oya will be the 7th of the African powers. You cannot invoke them or respect, praise them in the same area because they do not get along. So that's something to be mindful of. And again, when we get into actually kind of practicing or watching these practices, we'll get into this a little bit more deeply. Yamaya protects abused and neglected women and children and travelers over the sea. So again, the protection of humans is really central. Protection, care, guidance over humans is really central. And I think I again, when we're looking at the kind of dichotomy between like Christianity and those representations, this might be where it's easier to connect Orishas to angels, because I would say we probably tend to perceive angels as being, again, protecting, more nurturing, more caring over humans, as opposed to the ways that we might kind of see that dichotomy between angels and God. And God is seen as more of kind of the anger, the aggression, the punishment, that kind of aspect, the more patriarchal, right? The more kind of paternal aspect. So a little bit different here, where there's more of an emphasis on the care and protection, but there's also still the complexities. But we kind of see those complexities within a single Orisha, rather than them being kind of one dimensional, if that makes sense, right? They have those spectrums where they can kind of go either way. They could be caring, nurturing, but they can also punish as well. If you wanted to invoke Yamaya because she is an Orisha of the ocean, you would go to the beach, if you are able. But that would obviously be the best place. So her domain would be female fertility issues. So again, if you're seeking out kind of wanting to manifest things within these areas, you would go to Yamaya. Motherhood and children, abused women, overseas travelers, beauty, the ocean, ocean creatures, love, healing, abundance, people born under the water zodiac signs, anyone whose ancestors survived the passage from West Africa to the New World are her people, because of that passage, right? The protection of those who traveled, the transatlantic slave trade, and erotic dance as well. So more associated saints, the Black Madonna of Regla and Stella Maris. As I mentioned, she manifests as a mermaid or a beautiful woman wearing sea colors. She's seen as sexually charged, hair and clothes being decorated with shells, coral, and crystals, and things like that. Kind of the ways that we tend to see mermaids represented in many cases. Blue, white, and pearl would be colors associated with her because of the ocean. Some offerings would be seashells, jewelry, perfume, coral, flowers, watermelon, pomegranate, so on and so forth. And again, especially emphasis on those items that are invoking, like the seashells and the coral, items that are really invoking and connecting with her as kind of being the Orisha of the ocean. So having those types of shells and things. So Oshun, we did talk about a little bit when we watched that documentary. We were looking at the festival of Oshun, where they actually celebrate Oshun and worship Oshun over the course of a few days out of each year. And that is kind of a way of representing the relationship between Oshun and the people of Oshogbo, where the festival was going on. And they would worship Oshun, and they would make, and again, it's that reciprocal relationship, right? Like, I'm not just taking, I'm giving as well, right? I'm supporting, I'm helping you, I'm doing something for you, and vice versa. It's a mutually beneficial, mutually respectful relationship, right? There's mutual care, etc. So the people of Oshogbo must protect Oshun's gardens, essentially, and care for the land, not hunt on that land, not harvest or forage on that land, protect that land and honor that land in exchange for protection for the people. And protection of the city of Oshogbo. So we kind of talked about her a little bit in that context, and we did talk about her in a similar way that we're kind of talking about Yamaya. The way that the Oshun was kind of spoken about in Oshogbo, and the way that she is worshipped as that kind of Orisha through which all life flows. So she is the Orisha of the river. So of course, that's where you would go to invoke her if you are able. And again, as I said before, when you're doing offerings and things like that, and you are discarding of those items, especially if they are items that that are biodegradable, that can be thrown into the water, then you can actually then do that and discard of those items in the river. Baptism by water invokes her purifying essence. When she calls to you, it's like a gentle river enveloping you. But if she's angered, watch out. So again, the complexities of all of these Orishas. It's never kind of one or the other. And that's why you have to be very mindful, when we get into, again, how to worship these orishas. They can be very particular about how they want to be worshipped. So understanding those details becomes really important of kind of what the expectations are for how to kind of appropriately worship. So her domain is over all things that flow like water, love, milk, honey, money, etc. You would invoke her for cleansing rituals with water, to heal reproductive problems, for fertility, for romance, divination, employment, magic, and much more. Especially, you see, and I kind of mentioned Oshun is one of those orishas that's been especially popular in pop culture lately. And this is just one example that I've shown in the past, but Beyonce was invoking the imagery of Oshun, right, with her Lemonade album. So we had a lot of images, a lot of her performances that were invoking that. And this, gold and yellow being some of the colors that are associated with Oshun. I don't think, we're not there yet. But those being some of those colors, because we associate her with sunflowers as well. So you see folks especially pray to her in the context of divination, in the context of romance and cleansing. And Oshun will not come to a dirty home. So if we were to do any kind of a ritual with Oshun, a big part of kind of the pre-ritual part of the ritual is you must clean your home. You must cleanse it, clean it, but also cleanse it with some type of a cleanser. So if you're familiar with Florida water, for example, kind of like that holy water, right? That cleansed water. That would be something that you can kind of put into some type of a floor wash, or you can make a wash and actually kind of wash your home with it. And that becomes a way of kind of cleansing the space to invite her in, because she will not come to a dirty home. Because Oshun and Yemaya are believed to be sisters, they in many cases will get invoked together. But Oya and Oshun also don't get along. So Oya and Oshun and Oya and Yemaya do not get along. So do not invoke them together. But you can invoke Oshun and Yemaya together, the sisters. And again, more imaging, you'll notice she's always kind of represented in gold. And with that documentary that we saw, the cowrie shells were being used in the priestess initiation to invoke Oshun. Because they were in the city of Oshogbo, where they especially venerate Oshun. They especially praise and worship Oshun. So her domains would be motherhood and babies, fertility. So again, especially for someone who would be wanting to manifest a pregnancy, maybe they're having pregnancy complications, and that's kind of the area of focus is reproduction, reproductive health. They may want to then invoke Oshun and Yemaya because those are their areas, those are their domains. Motherhood and babies, fertility, healing, cleansing, love, romance, self-love, rivers and fresh water, divination, witchcraft, and wealth. So she's seen as a beautiful woman wearing yellow or gold and 5 golden bracelets with a mirror at her belt. As a mermaid, manifests in cinnamon and honey, as fresh running water, waterfalls, and so on. And again, yellow, gold, and orange are the colors we tend to see her associated with her. Also, though, peacocks get associated with Oshun as well. So obviously those colors and green, purples may also be associated with her, but usually you might just see her holding a peacock feathered fan. And we'll talk about, again, those items as we get more deeply into each of the orishas. So you can offer her a mirror, rosemary, and keeping in mind when you have the offerings, you can never keep them, right? You have to dispose of them. So that is something to be mindful of when you're deciding what to offer, because you will be leaving those things behind. Marigold, pumpkin, makeup, brushes, perfumes, oils, flowers, sandalwood, honey. And if you do give Oshun honey, always taste it before offering it to her. The legend is that she was almost poisoned by honey, and so you must do that first. Chamomile tea, yellow and orange fruits and veggies, cinnamon, river stones, amber coral, and so on. All of these different offerings. She's associated with river fish, leopards, crocodiles, crickets, vultures, parrots, and peacocks. And we will talk about why that is, and especially in the context of the peacock. The peacock tends to be a symbol that Oshun is especially associated with. And actually, I had mentioned last time that I have an Oshun like statue on my wall, essentially, a little art piece. I'll see if I can show it to you really quickly. And again, the image quality is not great for whatever reason. But over there on the wall, you can see that's Oshun with the crown on her head and two peacocks surrounding her. So it just so happens that someone that works for my parents had found that at a yard sale or something and gave it to my dad. And then I saw it hanging in the garage and I ended up taking it home. So it was pretty cool that I got my hands on it. But she tends to be associated with peacocks, and that we will get into that story another time, but it has to do with, again, her transforming into a bird, into a peacock to go and save humans. So we'll get into that story another time, but point being, you know, there are always reasons for these associations. And again, with those different manifestations of Yoruba over time, that might inform some of those different images. So we'll kind of get into those distinctions, and I'll try to flesh that out as much as possible. So Shango is the sixth of the seven African powers, and he's known as one of the hot Orishas in the context of being an Orisha, who is kind of the Orisha of thunder and fire. He's seen as the fertile male god who is intimate with Oba, Oshun, and Oya, and that might be, again, part of the conflict, and we'll talk about that later. Keep he and Ogun far from each other. They are rivals. So we'll talk about all of the rivalries between the Orishas. Shango brings justice through lightning and protects his followers from evil. He loves music, women, and fun because, again, joy, fun, celebration, pleasure is really central to this practice, to this tradition. So he's associated with thunder and lightning, justice, protection, male fertility, the sky, music, musical instruments, love, dancing, and fighting. And he manifests as a powerful, handsome man with a red coat and cowrie shells, and lightning with a double axe. And you can kind of see that there. You can offer him copper, mugwort, high John the Conqueror root, and we can actually talk about the history. I don't know if you folks have already covered the history. Have you happened to talk about the history behind high John the Conqueror root?
We have not yet, no.
Okay, perfect, cool. So that's something that we can talk about. And that, again, goes right back into the history of slavery and resistance. So that will be a fun conversation. More offerings would be spicy foods, red food, red palm oil, liquor like red wine and rum, and so on. He's associated with animals like the horse, ram, leopard, crocodile, turtle, and lizard. And then Oya is the seventh of the African powers. And again, she does not get along with Oshun or Yamaya, so you can never invoke them together unless you're invoking all seven of the African powers. That's the only exception. So she's the last of the seven African powers. Sometimes, though, she is substituted out. And again, this is going to depend on the tradition. So we can get into those other figures as well, those other Orishas, at another time. She manifests as a horned water buffalo or as a beautiful woman. Her domain is the Niger River, fertility, secrets, shapeshifting, spirits, cemeteries. Even if you were doing an invocation for fertility, you could not invoke Oya with Yamaya or Oshun, unless you were invoking all seven of the African powers. Her domain is also secrets, shapeshifting, spirits, cemeteries, and so on. Fertility, I mentioned already, magic, divination, women's secrets, female warriors, cemeteries, spirits of the dead, horse farms, libraries, healing of ancestral lines. And there have been a lot of conversations about this kind of work, healing of ancestral lines, doing, ancestral healing, right? Looking at the kind of generational trauma and kind of stopping those lines of generational trauma. And again, especially in the context of oppression. So thinking about slavery, thinking about the fact that there were people who were enslaved who obviously they were going through extreme exploitation, violence, coercion, etc., right? Manipulation, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, especially there was physical violence, obviously, but all of those different aspects that they had to live through. And not having the avenues, obviously that would be traumatizing, not having the avenues to heal the trauma, right? Not having the resources, and that kind of getting passed down generation to generation. So that's intergenerational trauma. And historical trauma in the context for Black people of slavery, and that being kind of the roots of the historical trauma. And you may have heard that language used. We also talk about historical trauma for like Japanese folks and their descendants, for folks who were in Japanese internment camps, or for Jewish folks, again, Holocaust survivors and their descendants. There's what's called epigenetics, and it's the study of how trauma gets passed down genetically from generation to generation. So a big part of like why this work is so important, and why it's been so cool to see these types of conversations happening recently. I personally am really excited to see this kind of stuff popping up a lot more. So, but there's a reason why we see this kind of stuff come up, right? For these different orishas, right? We're talking about healing a lot. We're talking about justice, right? Those legacies of violence, of oppression, are really central to these practices and to these belief systems. And that's really always something to kind of keep central. Her domain includes winds, including hurricanes in particular, and marketplaces. She manifests as a water buffalo, as a beautiful woman. She wears 9 copper bracelets. She manifests as an antelope. Colors associated with her are maroon and purple shades. Some offerings for her: flowers, star fruit, plums, purple grapes. And one thing you'll notice, right, some of the associated colors, think about the offerings and the correlation between kind of choosing offerings of that particular color as well. Something that you see happen a lot. And so you can set up an altar at home or set offerings at cemetery gates for her, since the cemeteries are her domain as well. And then the animals she manifests as, and then locust sheep. I think she also manifests as a horse, but and then we will get into the origin story later on. So one thing that I wanted to do, just with the time that we have left, is I wanted to show a video, and it's just for entertainment purposes, as I kind of mentioned before. Let me just pull it up really quickly. But it's just looking at the kind of corresponding orishas, and explaining, for, children of Oshun. Here are their particular characteristics, essentially. So first, I'm just going to put on this video that talks about how to find your guardian orisha properly. And then we can kind of get into the other one another time, just because the other one's a little bit more lengthy, but that one would actually talk about, here's your parent orisha, and then here is kind of your corresponding personality type. And so it's very similar to the horoscopes.
Okay, Alafiani, everyone. I am back. With another video, and this video has been a long time coming. Something that has been irking me for a long time, but I felt like I didn't have the authority to speak on it. Now I feel like I can kind of share a little insight and warning for you all that are seeking spiritual knowledge and the Orisha path. Now, I stay in my lane. I'm not trying to veer off into anyone else's lane, anyone else's tradition or things like that, Kemetic science and things. I appreciate that. And I recognize the universality of the Orisha energies, whether it be in Hinduism, the Kemetic netters and netters, but we're talking about modern day African spiritual tradition. But today I'll be discussing the protocols within modern African spiritual tradition from a Lukumi and an Isheshe traditional Nigerian standpoint. Now, Lukumi and Isheshe, they differ a lot, but basic things will always be the same. So I will begin. This video is more of a precautionary tale to advise you to be careful when you are out there trying to figure out who your Orisha is. Because I see so many videos out there where people are doing videos and they're claiming, oh, I'm a child of Elekba, I'm a child of Oshun, I'm a child of Yemoja, Shango, but they haven't gone to the right avenue to get that confirmed, because there is a way to confirm it. And anything else you get out there in the ocean of spirituality can be confusing and deceiving, because when you are trying to tap into your spirit guides and your higher angelic forces to see what your nature is, you can get confused either by charlatans or masquerading spirits. So you want to be very, very careful how you go about seeking who your guardian Orisha is. Because the first thing you want to do if you are beginning an African spiritual tradition is, number one, get a relationship, if you don't already have one, with your own Ori, which is your head, it's your soul, your higher self. It is your connection to the creator and all there is. When a child is born and has a soft spot, that is where the soul enters upon birth. So getting a good relationship and being in alignment with your crown chakra and your solar plexus is going to be the first step. I don't care what tradition you're in, whether you're Muslim, whatever you are, it starts with the self first, because that is your first connection to the creator. Your next line of defense along with that would be your ancestors, your Egun or your Egu. So you want to develop a strong relationship with them. And then your next step after that is spirit guides. You can start getting mediums and different people that specialize in determining those spirit guides that are not necessarily angelic forces. You can get them to come help you and guide you and meditate towards finding out who your spirit guides are. But when you get to talking about Orishas and higher angelic forces, higher up the ladder, because there's humans, ancestors, which are the more benevolent ones, and then they have ghosts somewhere in between on that ladder, and your higher spirit guides, the Orisha will go higher than your spirit guides, right there underneath the creative energy itself. So I'm going to tell you about my experience my freshman year of college, where a woman who I found out was not even a priestess, she claimed to be a daughter of Yemaya. She tried to read me and tell me who my Orisha is with 4 cowrie shells. And if you are in African spiritual tradition, you know that you cannot read somebody with 4 cowrie shells. That's not even legitimate per se. So I want you to look out for those type of things and be very careful of going to Etsy and different sites like this and people telling you, oh, you're this person, you're that person. You may carry the energy of a certain Orisha and a person may pick up on that influence, but that is not a strong confirmation. Tarot cannot do it. I do read tarot cards, and I am an Orisha priestess now. I am crowned officially, but I would never read tarot cards trying to do an Orisha reading for someone. That is a different form of divination, which is called Erendilowu or Dilowu, which deals with the cowrie shells, which is how the Orishas speak to mankind. The 2 ways that Orishas speak to mankind through Eoloshas and Babaloshas, which are Orisha priestesses and priests, is through those cowrie shells, the Dilowu. And that is not for anyone else to be using if they are not crowned and not initiated, because they have books out there where you can read about the positions and things, but that does not give you the authority to work with them. And that doesn't mean if you go buy some shells and try to throw them, that those shells are awake and give you a correct answer, because you can throw anything on the ground and it'll give you a position, but that doesn't mean that it's legitimate. And that's when you open yourself up, kind of like Ouija boards, to get it messed up in the game, trying to do something that you don't have the authority to do, with all due respect. So tarot is not it. Tarot is more of dealing with your ancestors, your spirit guides, and your monthly energy, or maybe spanning up to 3 months, 6 months to a year. It does not have to do with Orisha divination. The next group of people that are qualified in reading your head Orisha, besides a skilled cowrie shell diviner known as an Italero, or a Tablero, or an Oriate, which is an Orisha priestess or priest, would be the Babalawos, which are the high priest. They work with the Orisha Orumila. Orumila is the Orisha of destiny. He is the Orisha that is.
I just want to interject really quickly. This would be the seventh of the seven Orishas that we were just talking about. So Orunmila sometimes is used in place of Oya. So we were talking about Oya.
Kind of, I would say he's the Akashic librarian that remembers all of our fate and what we decided to do before we incarnated to the earth realm. He's the one that keeps record of our soul contract. So the Babalawos are the priests that work with the Rumila, and they have to literally bring you down to the divining system, which is called Ifa, which is considered the mouthpiece of the creator, Olodumare, using either the Iki or the Okwele. Now, Okwele is not used when you're bringing Orisha down. That's a basic monthly reading you will get from a Babalawo where they're flipping a chain back and forth. Now, if you're trying to find out your guardian Orisha, it will take more than one of those Babalawos, those priests of Ifa, because they have to be there to witness, and they will be using something called the Ikin, the sacred palm nuts, which they have the authority to use. Without divulging too much information to you, I just want you to be aware of these basic things that an Aleo, who is a newcomer and non-initiated person, has the right to know so that they do not get to see. So it's not tarot. You cannot find out your Orisha through tarot because it doesn't even deal with those type of archetypes. Even if you're using like a special deck that has, I know they have tarot of the Orishas, has nothing to do with the initiated Orisha tradition. You cannot use runes. You cannot use 4 cowrie shells. That's ludicrous. You can't just go in meditation and now I see who my guardian angel is. Now I'm not discrediting that you can't maybe see an Orisha in meditation. As an Aleo and non-initiated person, because I used to dream about my guardian angel before I even found out and confirmed it when I received Hand of Ifa. I don't have my E-Day on right now, which a person that has Hand of Ifa wears because I broke it, but I did dream of my guardian angel before I actually got the confirmation, but you can't do it that way. So meditation is not it. Past life regression is not it. Going to a misa and sitting there is not it. Now, tarot, rules, meditation, past life regression, misa, those are all legitimate forms of connecting with spirit, but it is not the proper way for determining your Orisha. I don't care what anyone says. I don't care how beautiful your altar is, your unofficial altar, with all due respect. That is not the proper way if you avoid the African traditional route, either Lukumi or traditional Nigerian Isheshe. The 2 ways, once again, to find out who your guardian Orisha is. First of all, you have to have a reading to determine if you are even eligible to receive Hand of Ifa or finding out who your guardian Orisha is. Because in our tradition, we're not like the Jehovah's Witness where we just knock on people's door trying to evangelize people and say, oh, you have to be with us. No, we can actually have friends and associates who have nothing to do with it. Christianity, Muslims, because it's a tradition more than a religion. And it just not be their path. You can go see an Orisha priestess, a priest, and they tell you, baby, this is not your path, honey. Your soul decided that it actually wanted you're not going to believe this, but your soul actually decided that it wanted to incarnate to do either some type of Buddhism, or it just depends on whatever your soul chose to do. It's not going to be for everybody in this lifetime to deal with the Orishas and go to Ifa and that type of thing. That doesn't mean that you don't have their protection and that they don't guard your head, but it's just not for everyone to even go that far with it. Some people don't go any further than getting the ceremony of the legacies, which is also something that is a ceremony that you have to receive. You can't just go buy them off eBay or Etsy and then say, oh, I'm an Orisha practitioner, I have legacies. No, those things have to be fed, energized, and awakened. So once again, Hand of Ifa, which you receive from a Babalawo, and you need more than one Babalawo. It is a 3-day ceremony where Ifa is brought down on the 3rd day to determine who your guardian angel was, where Orumila is awakened to remind you of which Orisha decided to accompany you into the earth realm. The second way is through a master Iyalosha or Babalosha Orisha priestess or priest, called an Oriate or Italero in Lukumi. And they can tell you through a special ceremony to where they tell you who your Orisha is, but not just a basic 21-day reading. It was a special type of reading. And the best way to find out through an Oriate is when you're getting ready, if you have to crown and make oath till they find out. Because even if you do get Hand of Ifa, your head can actually change. once you get to Ultra and become a priestess or priest, if that's meant for you. Some people are not going to go that far. With hand of Ifa, please be aware that for females, it's different rather than males. There's Ikofa for women. I say females because a 2-year-old little girl can get it. That's why I'm not saying women. So I'm not trying to denigrate women. But you can be a 1-year-old child. Ikofa, hand of Ifa, that's what it's called for women. So once again, hand of Ifa is called Ikofa for females. Hand of Ifa for males, which is baby boys up to grown men, is called Awo Faka when you receive your hand of Ifa. Now, in Remo in Nigeria, they have a tradition called Ishode, which I have as well, to where, well, I'm not going to say all that, it's too much, but a woman makes a pact with the Iyami and she's an Akritebi, which is called the wife of Orumila or Ifa, and she has this pact with Orumila to where she can also find out who her guardian Orisha is because the king are brought down when the woman receives Sode. Some men receive it too, but it's usually for women. Once again, I reiterate and I stress the Iyalosha, the Babalosha are not Babalawos. They are Orisha priestesses or priests. Now, all Babalawos, well, let me not say that. Some Babalawos are Iyaloshas and Babaloshas, but once they make Ifa, they work with Orumila and Orumila's form of divination, which is the Ofele or the Iking. And Iyalosha can become an Iyanifa if she is in the Isheshe traditional version of the Orisha tradition known as Ifa. But and Iyalosha, Babalosha, they work with the Serendilobum or Dilobum. And that is how you find out who your guardian Orisha is, not through all of this new age, hippie, crystal type of thing. Not discrediting that, not disregarding it, because I'm into that as well. But when I do this is home for me. This is protocol, and I respect this. I take this seriously because I take people's destinies seriously, and I don't want you to go through some of the things that I went through in my 17-year sojourn as a Aleo and Orisha, so I can say some of the pitfalls that I went through so that y'all can see. Another thing is I want to discuss is just because you're a woman does not mean that you have one of the female Orishas. You may not be Yemoja Oshun or Ya. You might actually be a woman that's a child of Eshu, Elekba. You might be a child of Ogun as a woman. You might be a child of Shango. Now, in Benin, they usually do not crown a woman a male Orisha or a male a female Orisha, but in Lukumi and traditional Nigerian Isheshe, you can be a woman with a male Orisha. So don't be walking around thinking, oh, one of the female Orishas is my head guardian. So don't be surprised if you're a woman and you're very feminine and you come out and you're still a child of Shango. So anything can happen. Be prepared for that. Don't just go through the stereotypes that they have. Now, I have seen instances where I have met people and they have no knowledge of who the Orisha are, and they're like playful and they're mercurial. They act like and I'm like, oh my God, you're a jokester, you're a trickster. You have to be a child of Eshu. You have to be a child of Elegba. Or I see people who they don't drink alcohol. They're very level-headed. They're good leaders. They put their shoes and socks on in an organized fashion. I'm like, oh, that is a child of Obatala. Or I see a woman that's very preppy and prissy and Miss Anne. I'm like, oh, that's a daughter of Oshun. Or I see a woman that's standoffish. She's aloof, but she loves children. She's nurturing. I say, oh, that's a daughter of Yemaya. Or I see a man that is kind of cocky and he's a ladies' man. I would say, oh, that's a son of Shango. But keep in mind, I can sit there and say that all day based on those people's personalities, and that may not be their head Orisha. Now, usually in most traditions, most Orisha traditions, you get both a mother Orisha and a father Orisha. So that Orisha, the opposite Orisha can still be their parent Orisha, but that may not be their head Orisha. Another thing is too, you can go get a basic 21-day reading from an Orisha priestess or priest or Babalawo, and an Orisha may come up to defend you. That does not mean that's your head Orisha. You may have a problem going on for that next 21-day time period that particular Orisha specializes in, so they help you during that 21-day time period. Does not mean that that's your guardian angel. And the other Orishas can have an affinity towards you and have love for you, but that once again does not confirm that they are your head guardian. Another thing is too, as an aleo, which is a non-initiate or newcomer that is seeking the path of Orisha, it is okay if you want to connect with Elegba Ogun, maybe at the crossroads, or Elegba, or going to the forest and meditating on the energy of Ogun, or if you're feeling down and you need that motherly love, going to the sea or lake for Yemoja, going to the river for happiness and flow in your life for Oshun, that's perfectly fine. But because you're connecting with the forces of nature, which the Creator has given us all access to. But to say, oh, I'm a child of this one or that one, you're kind of skating on thin ice when you do that. Not necessarily because of elders saying you should not do that, but for your own clarity, you don't want to be misled on your path. Once again, if you looked at my video on soul contracts and soulmates and soul groups and things like that, you may have a soul contract to go north, but you want to go south. So what I'm saying is your head may have a soul contract with Obatala, but you want to be a son of Shango so bad. So your life gets out of alignment and it doesn't go right because you want to be Shango so bad in the south when you're supposed to go north to be Obatala and manifest all that Obatala is. Does not mean that Shango does not defend you, does not love you, does not mean you don't have his traits. But this is the reason why it is so important, if you're on the Orisha path, to get a proper confirmation from the proper elder, initiated, reputable elder, to confirm this, because this is your life you're dealing with, and you don't want to be misled going the wrong way. It's like having your shoes on the wrong foot. You're all confused and you end up stuck and messed up in the game. Your luck ends up getting compromised. So that is why it's not about arrogance or haughtiness. It's about certain protocols for your protection, not the elder's ego, but to protect your destiny, your path, and that you do not get deceived by masquerading spirits, because there are plenty low-level entities that would like to masquerade and make you think you have something that you do not have, or make you think that you are something that you are not, and your energy doesn't perfectly align with that. So if you're going to go about that path, first of all, go find a reputable elder, get a reading, and see if this is even for you. This might not be for you. It's not for everybody. You can still have an appreciation for it and only go so far. Some people get their necklaces or their warriors, which is Eshu, Elegba Ogun Chosi, and if you're Lukumi Osun, and that's as far as they go. They don't make it to priestesshood or priesthood. It's not for everybody. I keep reiterating that. So this is for your protection. This is advice. Take it or leave it. You have free will. Do what you want to do. Go which way you want to go. But share your experiences with me. What are your experiences or horror stories on your path to Orisha, or finding out about African traditional systems? Leave it in the comment box. Like, share, and subscribe. Peace and bliss. Talk to you next time.
That was a great video. She's wonderful. That was awesome.
I agree. I'm gonna send. I will embed that in the notes just so everyone has it, and I will send you the link as well, Alex, just so that you have that for the website.
Thank you so much. I would love to put that on the website. That is awesome.
One thing I wanted to do that I did last time before we kind of split for the night is I just wanted to ask if there were any questions that I can, as we're continuing to learn about the different Orishas and the origin story, if there are particular questions that are coming up that I can make note of as we're kind of going through this stuff.
I don't think so. I asked a lot of questions last time. We went over a few of them in this class, and I know that there are things that we're going to go over in the future. So yeah, I think that I have a lot of questions, but all of them are just things that we're getting to.
Okay. Yeah, understandable. And I do have all of the questions from last time. And then there was something that came up in and I've got the question about, oh yeah, so we can talk about that. And why she doesn't get along with Oshun and Yamaya. And then there was one other thing I want to say that came up in the comments earlier. Divination. And that was something that was touched on briefly in that video, but that's something that we can talk about more, especially in the context of the cowrie shell, since as was mentioned, that is kind of a prime, or one of the primary, there are multiple, but that's one of the primary like tools, divination tools in Yoruba. And she was talking about Lukumi. So Lukumi is the offshoot of Yoruba that is manifesting in Cuba in particular. Or, I'm sorry, Puerto Rico.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
Yeah. So I'll try to mention that as we talk about those different offshoots. And when we're talking about like hoodoo and voodoo, that's the United States. But okay. Yeah, I'm just making note of the questions really quickly. And I was right the first time. So Lukumi is coming from Cuba.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Any other questions?
I think Tiggy asked one in the chat.
I have both of those down.
Okay, cool.
And then I have the one about divination. I can't remember if there was anything else that came up just while we were talking. But if anything else comes up, I think that was everything. One thing I mentioned is I will also talk about Oya and the other two Orishas that sometimes are in kind of substituted in place. So we can talk about that as well. And then we can just get really into detail. I think maybe each week we would cover a couple Orishas just so we can get really more detailed into their not backstories, but more information about them and their relationships with one another, etc. Just so we have a deeper understanding. So if anything else comes up before then, let me know. But we will just continue kind of getting into this stuff more deeply. And we will, as I'm getting into each of them, we'll probably actually get into what it looks like to invoke, what it looks like to create altars for those different Orishas as well.
Awesome. That'll be so cool.
I agree. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, and then we can talk about the gender expressions. And I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier or not. I think I may have, but Olodumare, who is the main aspect, the kind of all-powerful, all-knowing aspect of God, the supreme being, or supreme power, that aspect of God transcends the gender binary. So we see that sometimes where we have some of these orishas that exist outside of the gender binary. So we can kind of talk about that a little bit more. But one thing to keep in mind is in Africa, the concept of the gender binary did not exist before European colonization. So the gender binary, that two-gender system, is actually a colonial construct. So we'd have to get into the history of how that colonial construct ends up influencing the ways we understand the gender expressions, because we did, in indigenous, pre-colonial indigenous spiritual practices and just in everyday life in our societies, we did see what we today now would consider to be like queer expressions, where we are transcending the binary. The concept of gender and sexuality did not exist. So your role in society is really what defined and your expressions, right? How we would understand the ways we perform. Gender is something we do, it's something we perform. The clothing you wear, your mannerisms, the way you speak, your tone of voice, your physical appearance, all of those different things about gender expression, the ways that we understand, gender expression, all of those things were markers of identity in a very different kind of way than we understand gender and sexuality today. So we could definitely kind of unpack that more deeply. And I know there was interest in those conversations around gender, so we could really take some time and dedicate it to getting into that. I teach women's studies And I do have a very short article that kind of talks a little bit about that history of colonization and implementing the two gender system. So I can share that and I'll send that to Alex. I'll send a PDF out that can get put on the website. And then maybe for folks who are interested, I'll just kind of put it out there as a recommended reading and just bring it into the conversation for next time so we can really get into some of those gender dynamics.
Awesome. That sounds great. I would love that. And I know a lot of other students here are really interested in that. Wow. So I think that would be awesome.
Cool. Yeah, I'll absolutely send that. And yeah, anything else that comes up, I'll just kind of take a look at what I have. I was offering anyway, I always want to throw this out there. I was offering a free class. All the stuff I teach at the university level, I wanted to give to the community for free. So I'll kind of see what I have that's relevant to these conversations and I'll send that stuff out first and then we can kind of go from there. But I can send out as much stuff as you're interested in.
Thank you. I would love that. I'm interested in all of the things. So thank you. That is so great. You're wonderful.
No problem. Yeah, so I'll send you that information. And then if there are any requests that come up, like since there was an interest in talking about gender expression at any time, you can always reach out to me on Facebook. I'm in the divination group and you can contact me and I'll just type it so you have it. But Rosetta Radix is the name I go by on Facebook. So if you ever want to throw out any recommendations, suggestions, yeah, definitely don't hesitate to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Corey.
Yeah, no problem. I look forward to talking to y'all, connecting with y'all next week and getting into this stuff more deeply. It's really fun for me to learn about as well.
Hey, me too. I can't wait to see you next week. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
You as well. Take care. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Bye. Take care.